Good afternoon and welcome to Oasis Community Development Center and Oasis Church International Mental Health Forum. On today, we will be talking about grief and loss in a pandemic. So welcome. I am Minister and Evangelist Lisa Johnson, and I am the Mental Health Coordinator at Oasis Church International. We have with us today Pastor Jason Fairbanks, who will be presenting on today and also answering questions. We are on all of our social media platforms. We are on Zoom. We are on Oasis Church International, oasischurchintl.org, international Facebook. We are also on our website. We are also on Oasis Community Development Center's website, and we are also on YouTube. So please share with your friend, loved ones, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who you feel that may benefit from this session on today. We are living in a I think this is probably the most difficult times that most of us have seen in our generation. And it has been a very tough time. So out of all of the mental health forums that we have been presenting that has been very helpful, we saw a need to also deal with grief and loss because we know that we're in this COVID-19 pandemic that's not going anywhere. Hopefully it will go away sometime soon. We've lost loved ones. I've lost classmates. My pastor is burying her sister on today. So we're just really dealing with a lot. So I am very pleased to announce Pastor Jason Fairbanks. I do want to let you know that we will be answering questions. We have Mrs. Tamika Wright, who will be in the background looking at questions that you may have on Facebook. Please type them in the chat, and she will ask the questions to Mr. Fairbanks. And we will also be answering questions that you may have in our live Zoom. So Mr. Fairbanks, Jason Fairbanks, oversees the bereavement services of VITAS Healthcare. For the past 12 years, he has provided support to families before and after the death of family members. For the past year and a half, he has done extensive work with those who have lost loved ones to COVID and the unique aspects of grief they experience as a result of that loss. He is a clergy person in the United Church of Christ and the pastor of First Congregational Church of Lake Worth. Welcome, Jason Fairbanks.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's good to be with you. It's good to be with all of you. And let me just lift you up in doing this work and coming together and having these conversations around mental health. Not always easy conversations to have, but just so important for our whole beings. And so it's a privilege to be with you. I'll just double down on what Lisa said about questions. I spend time talking to people about end of life and grief and death, which are subjects that we do not talk about in our society. So if you have questions about that, there's no question that is dumb. There is no question that's too weird. So this is an opportunity to ask. So I'll encourage you to be thinking about those. And I know, grief and end of life isn't something that we spend a whole lot of time thinking about. And my understanding from what we've talked about just the past few minutes is that some of you are younger. And so we're especially not thinking about it then. And not that we should be all the time. You're in the period of life when you're thinking about your future and what you're going to accomplish and what you're going to do, as it should be. But here's the one thing in life that unites all of us, no matter the color of our skin or how much money we have in the bank or what our education level is. We're all going to come to the end of life. We're all going to have loved ones that come to the end of life. Things happen, and we pray to God for healing. And quite often we experience that, the healing of God. There are other times when God has other plans, and all of us come to that place eventually where we're going to come to the end of life. And if we're fortunate, if I can use that word, we first experience that through grandparents, and then we'll experience that with our parents and other loved ones. So what I'm going to talk about today for just a few moments is first of all, grief and the experience of grief, how that's been complicated over the past year and a half, because of the pandemic and because of loved ones that we have that have died of COVID. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we can engage that. What are some tools that we can use to help us through that process? And yes, as Lisa said, I am a pastor and I am a chaplain. And I'm a chaplain with VITAS Hospice. And for those of you that might not know what hospice care is, hospice provides holistic medical and emotional and spiritual care for those that are in the last months of life. So if someone has a terminal illness such as cancer, the later stages of Alzheimer's, and a number of other illnesses, hospice is a service that's completely paid for by Medicare, that provides nursing and doctor and social work visits and chaplain visits for those at end of life, both to provide care and support for the patient and to provide care and support for the family during that time as well. So if you have any questions about hospice care, I know sometimes we hear that and aren't quite sure what that is, but if you have any questions about that, would be happy to answer those as well. So I am going to share my screen and just to kind of give us some things to point us in the right direction as we're talking. I also have a handout that I'll share a link to at the end. You don't need the handout for what I'm talking about. And I'll also put up my information as well and how to contact me. And always open to phone calls. One of the things that I do with VITAS is I don't just provide support to those families who have had loved ones that have died on hospice care, but we also provide support to the community. And that's just, it's just, if you need someone to talk to as you're processing grief that you might experience, that's a free service that we provide for the community. There's no charge for that. And I'm always very open in sharing my information because there's not a whole lot of folks that want to talk about that. We just don't want to talk about it. So if there's someone that's willing to talk about it and do the work, I always want to make sure that I am making myself available to them. So I'll share my information in a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about some myths of grief, some things that we might have heard. So one myth is all bereaved, so anyone that's lost a loved one, grieve in the same predictable way. The fact is there is no right or wrong way to grieve. We all grieve differently. It's based on our personality. It's based on our relationship with the loved one that has died. So let's say your mom died this week. Maybe my mom died 2 weeks ago. I still couldn't say to you, I know how you feel, because I'm not going to know exactly how you feel. We had different types of relationships with our moms. We have different personalities and the way we deal with things. So everyone is unique in the way they grieve. Another myth, healing from grief involves getting over the loss and generally takes about a year. And sometimes we'll hear that we might be grieving the loss of a loved one, and we have friends that are trying to be supportive, but they might say, well, shouldn't you be over it by now? And a truth is, one of the difficult truths is we never completely get over grief. We get through it. It becomes part of our story. But that's a wound that's always going to be there. And it's not like the flu. Everyone is unique. So maybe we get through it in a year. Maybe we get through it in 3 months, but maybe it takes longer as well. It's better not to think or talk about the pain. You'll hear sometimes, you have to be strong, and yes, we have to be strong. But we also, and we'll talk about this, we also have to allow ourselves to experience the pain of grief, because that grief is going to come out somewhere. I've spent the past 12 years specifically spending time with people that are grieving, and that we all grieve differently, but we all grieve. The intensity or the length of your grief reflects how much you love the deceased, not necessarily. Again, we grieve in all different kinds of ways. So what are some different ways that we experience grief? So there's a physical experience of grief. So we might not think about that a whole lot, but it includes dizziness and shortness of breath, and some lowered immunity long-term, sleeping and eating disturbances. So we either sleep a lot more than we used to, or sleep a lot less than we used to, or we might eat a lot less than we used to, or eat a lot more than we used to. Inactivity, so just not feeling like doing anything, or hyperactivity, feeling like we have to clean the whole house perfectly twice. That's the way some people experience the grief. And I'll let you know that none of these things are right or wrong. They just are. And so anything in moderation for short periods of time is, quote, normal as we're experiencing grief. The cognitive experience of grief, so how it evolved, how it affects our thinking. So it can become some confusion, irritability, paranoia, difficulty concentrating. We can feel kind of foggy, memory gaps, some hallucinations, auditory and visual hallucinations, odd dreams, and searching behavior. So that's like walking into a room and not remembering in the least why we walked in there. There's the emotional experience of grief. So that's what we think about most of the time when we think about grief. So there's shock and disbelief, pain and disorganization. Sometimes there's some anger. We're going to talk about this. Sometimes there's feeling of guilt, and of course that feeling of sadness and grief. Social experiences of grief, and we experience those most when we have a spouse or partner that dies, but it can be difficult being with others. We can feel jealous sometimes of people's happiness. So here we are, having experienced this death, having experienced this loss, and the rest of the world just seems like it's going on around us just like it was before. So that can cause some disconnect with us. Have to cope with changing relationships. If we were married, have to establish identity as a single person. So maybe you were married to someone, and I spent time with folks that have been married for 50 or 60 years. So they've been married much longer than they were single. And then all of a sudden that spouse has died and they have to completely re-navigate life. We can feel embarrassed about not being better yet. I should be over this by now. And there's the spiritual experience of grief, and that's mostly a positive experience. So when we grieve, it puts us into a place that's a little bit more, I'll use the word liminal. So we just kind of feel a little bit different. We can feel closer to God during that time. And so we have that spiritual feeling. So we renegotiate what's really important and meaningful to us. And we redefine the relationship with the deceased. We'll talk about that. We acquire new skills, and new relationships come into being. And sometimes we rekindle old relationships. We'll make plans for the future, and we can enjoy reminiscing about the loved one. So I want to talk a little bit about complications of grief from the the pandemic. So as I said, we don't spend a lot of time talking about death and grief in our world, in our society. But there are certain things that we do as a society when we have a loved one that's died. We have a funeral service a lot of times. We gather together as family and friends to support one another when we're grieving. And so because of the pandemic over the past 18 months and more or less over the course of those 18 months, we haven't been able to do that. And so the few things that we do to support one another when someone dies, we haven't been able to do. And then there's also the experience of loved ones that have died in a hospital or in a nursing home. And so we weren't able to be with them. One of the things that we do is we're at the bedside of those we love as they approach the end of life. And we have the ability to be there with them and hold their hand and tell them that we love them. And that was taken from so many people during the pandemic. They weren't able to be there, which was heartbreaking. And so that causes a lot of sadness, that causes a lot of anger, and anger is a completely normal part of grief. And then some things that the complications of grieving someone who has died of COVID. So all of those things that we talked about are normal aspects, and I put quotes around normal, of grief. So every time we have someone that has died, we're sad and we grieve them. But there are things that make that grief more complicated. And so sometimes that might be a loved one that has died in what we consider to be much too young. Complicated grief oftentimes is a parent that has a child that has died. Those are all complications to a normal grieving process. And so when we have a loved one that's died of COVID, we experience those to a greater extent. So sometimes there can be an increased anger. And I'll put the information of this, if you or someone has had a loved one that's died of COVID, I facilitate a support group specifically for those that have had loved ones that have died of COVID. But one of the things that we found is there's a whole lot of anger. Couldn't have someone had done something about this? Sometimes we can even be angry at the person that's died, and that's not unusual. I wish that they had been more careful. Why couldn't they have been more careful? And sometimes there's increased guilt. So I should have done something differently. If I had been paying more attention, if I had just encouraged them a little bit more, if I had been more careful, we start thinking, what if they contracted this from me? And so we have those increased feelings of guilt. We have increased anxiety. So one of the normal processes of grief is we start to think about our own mortality. And, all of the sudden, when we have someone that has died that's close to us, especially if that's the first time we've experienced it, we start to realize, oh my goodness, none of us live forever. So we can start being anxious about our own life. And so if we have a loved one that's died from COVID, that's even more pronounced because COVID is still all around us and we're still having to take precautions. This still hasn't been vanquished yet. So we can start becoming even more anxious than we were before about contracting COVID and the danger to our own life. And then there's constant reminders that are in the news. I mean, you can't listen to anything or read anything without hearing about COVID. And so most of the time when we have a loved one that died, we're thinking about it all the time, but we're not being reminded about it all the time from the outside. But with COVID, we are. Excuse me. In fact, one of the folks in my group made the mention that, you know, her husband died of COVID. She's out in the world and society, and every time she sees someone with a mask, even, it reminds her of how her husband died. In this group, when the vaccine started to become available at the beginning of this year, of course, people were happy that they were able to get the vaccine and receive some protection. But it was also a very sad time for them because their loved ones had died before the vaccine was available. So one lady was saying, you know, she was sitting there receiving the vaccine and she was crying, and the nurse said, well, you know, does it hurt? And she said no, but she explained the story about how happy she was for herself to be able to get this vaccine, but you know, wishing that her husband had been able to get that as well. So those are some things that make the grief regarding COVID a little bit more complicated. And so you might say, what do I do if I'm grieving? How do I stop grieving? You know, because most of us don't find that to be a pleasant experience. So just a couple of things before we start talking about some specifics. And one is this, and it's so important to remember for ourselves, and as we're trying to provide some comfort and support to those that are grieving. How you are grieving is the way that you should be grieving. How you are grieving is right for you. There is no one way through this. There's no one book that we can read that after we read it, we're not going to be grieving anymore. Grief takes the time that it takes, and it takes the path that it takes in our life. And that's just really important to remember, because I spend so much time with folks who are sad, who are grieving, and then they put this on themselves that they should be feeling some way that they're not. And it's just so important that grief is a part of our life and part of what we experience. I tell people all the time that I think 75% of what I do is let people know that there is not something wrong with them because of how they're feeling. So when we're grieving the death of someone, especially if it's the first significant loss that we've experienced, we feel things that we have never felt before. And so we think there's something wrong with us because we're feeling that way. And there's not. We're experiencing grief for the first time. A second generality is this, and it's really the only big word or phrase that I'll use today, but it's dual processing. The folks that seem to do best with their grief are folks that are doing two things. First of all, we're allowing ourselves to grieve, to cry, to wail, to spend some afternoons in bed. That is completely normal. Not only is it normal, it's necessary. So sometimes I'll talk to people and they'll say, well, yesterday was a bad day. Today is a little bit better. And so I'll always explore that a little bit. I'll say, well, why was yesterday a bad day? Well, yesterday was a bad day because I was going through some of my mother's things who has died, and I just started crying. And I couldn't control it. And they'll say, today is a better day because I haven't cried yet. And so what I'll try to do is help people see that both of those days are good days. It's a good day when we spend some time crying, because that's an important part of the process. And it's also good when we have a day that we can kind of get on with things a little bit. And so those tears are important. Now, sometimes those tears are inconvenient. If we're in the middle of the grocery store, if we're having lunch with a friend, if we're sitting in our office with colleagues at work, and one of those waves of grief, because that's what it is, that's what it feels like, come, then, sometimes they come in not the best times for us. But if we're in a place where we're by ourselves, if we're in a place where we have some trusted friends with us and one of those waves come, then sometimes the best thing is just to allow ourselves to feel it and experience it. But we also know that we can't stay there all the time, because that would just plumb wear us out. And so it's also important to take little breaks or vacations from our grief. And so we do that through the work, the responsibilities that we have, getting out and doing something, getting outside of ourselves and serving one another. Those are all ways that we take breaks from grief. So we've probably heard about grief processes like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the stages of grief. And those are important, and those are helpful, as long as we remember that grief rarely ever just works in a straight line. It's not like we do step 1, step 2, step 3, and oh my goodness, now it's Thursday and I'm not going to be grieving anymore. So those of you that have experienced grief know that that's not the way it works. So we go through the stages several times. So sometimes we'll be in denial, and then we'll go to anger, and then we'll go to depression, but then we might go back up to denial. So it's very much a cyclical process. One of the models that's most helpful for me, and one of the models that I see replayed over and over again, and a lot of people that I spend time with, are the 4 tasks of grieving. So what are some things that we need to do? And I didn't put his name up here, I'm sorry, but this is by William Worden. And so there's 4 things that William Worden says that we need to do. First is to accept the reality of the loss. And you might say, well, that sounds weird. Of course, I've accepted the reality of the loss. And so a lot of times we'll be in this place where in our head, we know that this person has died and they're no longer physically present with us. But it takes that a while to drop down to our heart. So I give the example all the time of a lady that I spent time with. She lived here in Florida. Her son lived in California. Her son had cancer and died. And so she was a smart woman. She was completely oriented. She knew that her son had died, but she says, Jason, I still feel like I can pick up the phone and call him like I did every afternoon when he was alive. And so it just takes some time for that to kind of settle in and us to be at the place where we fully accept and understand that that this person is no longer physically present with us. The second task is allowing ourselves to experience the pain of grief. So hopefully you remember that from just a couple of minutes ago when we were talking about that, because it's a huge, important part of the grieving process to allow ourselves to feel that and experience that. And even when we're feeling like we're in a place that we're somewhat safe, to even kind of move toward it and touch it, to risk doing that. Maybe taking the risk of going through some mementos or some remembrance of folks. The third thing is to adjust to an environment without the loved one physically present, to start to imagine what life looks like without this person physically present with us. So, whether that's a parent or whether that's a spouse or another loved one, to start to kind of adjust to that. And then the fourth thing is, and this sounds a little bit odd too, not to us as people of faith, thank goodness, but to others, to find a way, to find how you're going to connect to this person that's no longer physically present with us. So they're not physically present, but there's also still a bond, there's still a tie. Because we feel that's the reason why we're grieving. So it's how do we relocate that person? So, as people of faith, we have the confidence and the assurance that our loved ones are at home with God. So how are we going to continue to relate to them? So how will we remember them? Maybe visiting the graveside, maybe writing notes and doing some journaling about that. Maybe when we're in a tough situation where we might have before have gone physically to this person for some advice, it's just saying, I wonder what Aunt Mary would do in this situation. So figuring out those ways that we can stay connected to them while still, and here we go with that dual processing again, while still moving ahead and engaging in life. And sometimes those are really small. So we learn some new skills. So I had a lady that came to a bereavement group that I facilitated, and there was just a few of us here at this particular one. And all of a sudden, she broke down in tears. And the reason she did was her house had a driveway with pavers. And so sometimes when you have pavers, at certain times of the year, the ants come and get in those pavers. And so it was this time of the year. And she said, Jason, the ants are here. And my husband took care of that every year. I have no idea what to do. And I'm not good at stuff like that. So I didn't know what to tell her as far as what to do. But she made a point of calling me the very next week. And she had gone to Ace or Home Depot or wherever it was that she went. And she asked the folks there, and she found out what she needed in order to do that. She came home and did it and got rid of them. And that was something so small, but something that meant so much to her. And so the confidence with that gave her the confidence to do the next thing. And so we move ahead step by step in life. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll invite you to talk about some questions that you have about end of life or the grieving process. We're in a supportive environment here, so maybe if you want to share an experience or something that you're dealing with as far as grief, however I and the rest of the group might be able to be helpful in that.
Wow, that was wonderful. Very, very good information. I really appreciate all of the information you shared today, and I'm sure that everyone appreciates it as well. I was taking notes while you were presenting, and I was just, really honed in on just the side effects of grieving, the dizziness and the tightening of the chest and throat, which we call anxiety. And sometimes it's inevitable. So I have a question for you, and anybody else, if you have any questions, you can come off of mute or you can type them in the chat. We do want it to be very interactive, but, I want to, ask what are some techniques to get over the side effects of grief, because we know it's inevitable, especially like in the early stages the early stages of grief. What are some techniques that can be used?
So here are some things that I think are really important. And I know that I'm talking to people of faith here. So one thing is prayer, just going to God in prayer. And I know that we're practiced in this, and I know that we don't usually have the experience. Sometimes we miraculously do, where we go to God in prayer and say, I'm going to leave this here, and then we open our eyes and everything is fine. That doesn't usually happen exactly that way, but it is an aid. I think another thing is mindfulness meditation. So just sitting and relaxing in the line between meditation and prayer, for me anyway, is very thin. And so mindfulness meditation is just paying attention to how we're feeling. So we're feeling sadness. And so we just kind of sit with that. We don't try to get rid of it. because when we try to get rid of something, it tends to hold on a little bit harder. But I use a phrase called non-judgmental observation. So just noticing, you know, I'm feeling sadness right now. I'm feeling guilt right now. I'm feeling anger right now. You know, because while I'm sure we had good relationships with the ones that have died, they weren't always perfect. And sometimes there's some unresolved pain, even in the midst of the grief. So allowing ourselves to feel that, and again, just to observe that. And then another tip that I think is really important is especially in terms of anxiety. You know, if you get home from a long day at work, you've had a loved one maybe that's died of COVID, you're at work or you're at school. Some people are wearing masks and social distancing, others are not. You come home and you turn on the TV and they're talking about COVID. And so you might just be at a place where you're spinning. So I think for that, what's helpful is really trying to ground ourselves. And it's really simple. It's sitting down or closing our eyes or not closing our eyes and just feeling our feet on the floor, just paying attention to our feet on the floor, being quiet and listening to the different sounds. So maybe trying to identify 5 sounds that we can hear. And maybe it's just looking around the room and trying to identify 5 things that we can see. And just to give us that opportunity just to stop and to pay attention to what's around us. And that grounds us. And then always just practicing some deep breathing. It's really hard to be anxious when we're breathing deep. And just so spending some time doing that.
Very good, very good. I'm sure, you know, others will take, you know, your advice. So I have another question for you. Not everyone is a believer, you know, in Jesus Christ, and some people don't pray. So, you know, what type of advice do you give those that, you know, do not believe in God? You know, the best way to deal with their grief, because we do want to reach everyone. I agree, you know, prayer, you know, is what's kept me, you know, grief and even disappointments and hurts, etc. But what other kind of advice could you give someone that does not believe in a higher power?
That's
God is being the higher power.
That's a great question. So, and so in my work as a chaplain, I'm an interfaith chaplain. So I'm a person of Christian faith. That's the language in the system that works best for me. But I spend time with people of all different faiths, and I spend time with people with no faith, no named faith at all, because I believe we're all people of faith. We're all spiritual beings. So spirituality, as opposed to a specific religion, is simply a connection with something that is larger than ourselves. And so we all experience that in different ways, based on our faith background and our families of origin. So I think if someone specifically doesn't have that belief system, I think that's where mindfulness meditation comes into practice, because there's absolutely no need for a belief in a higher power in order to do that. And you know, one of the easiest ways to practice mindfulness meditation is just to sit and to close our eyes, or to soft focus on something in the room. And is thoughts, and you know, thoughts are anything, you know, things that we think and things that we feel, is those come up, we just allow them to, we don't try to get rid of them, like I said, because that doesn't work. Allow them to just pass through one side and out the other. You know, a way that I've heard it explained that's really helpful is laying and if you get anxiety about being in the water, then this is probably not the best image for you. But
Right.
it's like laying on the bottom of the ocean, and you were seeing boats that went up, and you would just see them pass over you and go out the other side of your field of vision.
Okay.
And then I think another thing that would be especially important is, again, so spirituality is connection with the larger, reaching out to folks, reaching out to friends that you can trust, that you know that your story is safe with them, and that they're going to have some bandwidth to listen to you talk. I think that would be especially important as well.
Very good. I do agree. I do believe, I'm from the Christian faith, and I do believe that there is a peace that only God can give. And that's the peace that the Bible talks about that surpasses all understanding, in the midst of grief. So I do believe that prayer works. I believe that when a person is grieving, it is not the time to, push your faith on them, but also, but encourage them.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's very, very common in the Christian faith, when you have times of grief and funerals, that, where there's many people that would give their lives to Christ, because we talk about, wanting to see our loved ones, someday that,
Yep.
may have given their lives to Christ. So how has your experience been with those that, are grieving and may want or not want to hear about just faith? How do we deal with that? Because I want us to get better at this. I want us to be able to help others. And I want those who are hurting and, broken and don't understand to be able to reach out. Number one, know that it's okay, but also reach out to someone and get the help that they need.
Lisa, that's such a good question, and it's such a big question because I think we as people of faith could do such a better job at this. And so, first of all, having conversations like this is a big part of that, because we don't think a lot about this. And I spend time with people at end of life, and I'll spend time with folks that are professed Christians and still are filled with fear and a lot of times anger at end of life. So, more so than what we say to those that we're supporting is who we are. My confidence in Christ is, how I express my faith.
Yes.
Is what gives me the strength to be with others during that time. So anything that I have to offer has got to, if it's going to be worth anything, has got to come out of the overflow of what I am experiencing in God. I believe that 100%.
Yes.
And so what that does is that gives me the capacity, to sit with folks that are in just some really tough places. I think sometimes there's the temptation for us as people of faith, when people are in a difficult time, to say, just pray about it. I'm going to be praying for you. You're going to get through it, and ignoring the place that they're in. So I think Psalm 23 is just, and we recite Psalms 23 all the time. But David, as he was writing that, he had to be going through such a difficult time during that time. And so you notice what he says is, he says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. So the valley of the shadow of death is a place where we all find ourselves in periods of our life. You know, sometimes we think, well, I must not be doing something right because I'm in this place. And that's not necessarily true. It's suffering is part of life. Scripture recognizes that over and over again. I'm sorry, I'm getting to preaching now, but I see so many people that beat themselves up because they're grieving or they're in that difficult place.
Right.
So, you know, we have the opportunity of being present with those that we love in those. Is there going to be an opportunity to explain the source of our strength and our hope? Yes, there will be. Usually there is. But what comes first is our willingness to be present to the grief and the sadness and the difficulties that people are encountering.
Awesome. What would you tell someone that have the question? I'm sure you get this a lot. Why did God allow this to happen?
Yeah. And so my answer to that changes, and my answer to that is imperfect. So, but I don't feel bad about that, because people a lot smarter than me have been having this conversation for a long period of time. And so if God is all powerful, why does God allow these things to happen? If God is all good, why do these things happen? And I can't give you an explicit answer for that. But here's how I sit with it. There are things that happen, and there's two reasons for that I see now. Ask me 2 months from now, I might give you a different answer. But there are people that intend harm. Unfortunately, that's a fact of life. There's people that fly airplanes into buildings. You know, there's leaders that commit genocide. You know, there's people that will harm us because of the color of our skin. Those are realities of life. And so that's one of the reasons that these things happen. And then secondly, we don't understand it now. We might understand it someday, but there's a certain amount of chaos in the world. There's storms that come. There are cells that divide in a way that they're not supposed to, and they cause cancer. That is part of our reality as well. So we are not promised in Christianity, we are not promised in any other faith tradition that we're not going to encounter difficult times. We're not. For those of us in the Christian faith, the cross stands right in the middle of it. That's a reality. Romans 8:28, you know, which is another one of those verses that we as Christians kind of throw around sometimes. But what Romans 8:28 says is all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. It does not say that all things are good, because all things aren't good. But as people of faith, we know that things work together for good. We are not promised that we won't face challenges and grief. We are promised that we do not face those alone. That you know, that we face those with God, that God is present with us in the midst of our grief and our challenges.
Yes. I love that. I love that you brought out Romans 8:28, because you're right. We use that scripture so loosely, but you know, during the time when we're in the midst of grief, you know, it's like, you know, are things working together? It took me back to when I lost my first child. My first child was a stillborn, and I was only 18 years old. And my baby stopped moving, and I just didn't understand, you know, like, why did my baby stop moving? And I remember my pastor at that time, Bishop John D. Alexander, saying, all things work together for the good of them that love the Lord and are the called according to his purpose. And, you know, I when I look back over my life, I understand why God took my baby. You know, she was an angel, you know, and I understood why at that time you know, even for the connection, you know, for me at that time, wasn't a good connection, you know. So God has a reason for doing things, and sometimes it's so hard, you know, to accept that. So, you know, everything that you talked about, I'm a big proponent of therapy. So I do believe in, you know, going to talk to someone. Sometimes, you know, we do shut down. We don't want to talk to, you know, people. Things happen and it kind of stops us, you know, or not, you know, completely stops us, but it kind of set us back. And it's okay, because I am one, you know, at that time, I didn't want to go to college. I didn't want to do anything, you know, because I needed to deal with the grief, you know, of my loss, you know, and being so young, I didn't understand that. But I wanted to share a scripture that is so well known as well, and it's Ecclesiastes 3:1-8. And this is another scripture that's usually, you know, read at a funeral. And I just want, you know, people to understand that this is the word of God. This is true. There are different times and there's different seasons, but our loved ones, those that have experienced loved ones that have been here with them, those are the most precious and valuable times that, you know, we've been able to have with them. So it says, to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to hear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. So I think, you know, it's so important that we do, you know, really understand those scriptures, because I think, you know, after time goes, there's an old mothers used to say, by and by, you know, we will understand by and by. I believe it's a song as well, you know, and it's so true. But my heart is just, you know, goes out, you know, to, you know, friends, classmates, loved ones, my pastor, who is, you know, my closest friend, you know, others, you know, that are losing people, and just to see, you know, the loss in the world today. So I want to ask you another question. Do we have any others, before I ask Jason some more questions, any others that may have questions for Jason? And then I'm going to shift. We have like another maybe 20 minutes. I want to shift after I ask this question into pretty much like just the loss of being able to be with loved ones in the pandemic as well. But before I shift, I want to ask you, what recommendation can you give those that are stuck in a stage of grief? I mean, when I say stuck, I mean like maybe 10, 20 years stuck. What kind of recommendation, and those that are newly facing grief, what would be your recommendation to them that may say, you know, I don't want to be stuck. I saw mama like this, or I saw father like this, you know, I don't want to be. What would be your recommendation?
So I think a first step, if you haven't done this yet, is to find a pastor, someone such as myself, and I put my information up there in the Zoom chat, and maybe it can be shared with the folks on Facebook as well. Again, I'll reiterate that I always am willing to put that information out there, and you can call me whenever, because most people aren't going to want to face and talk about that. And so sometimes, and I always differentiate between what I do and what a therapist does that you would see long term is sometimes it can be just a little bit of information, a little bit of someone that's willing to listening to your story to kind of bump us out of that place that we are. And a lot of times that will be the case. Other times, so, grief overlaps with other mental health and emotional issues. So other times, so if you've talked to someone such as your pastor or someone like myself, and it's obvious that there's something that is really keeping you there that might be beyond what we would call, and I hate the term, but I can't think of a better one, quote, normal grief, then it might be good to talk to a therapist for a little bit longer term. Everything, like I said, everything is normal in grief, in moderation and for a short period of time. So, for example, it's very normal after someone dies and after the funeral is over, not to want to be around anyone for a few days or a couple of weeks. That's a normal part of the grieving process. If you're like a lady that came to one of my groups, she walked in and said, this is the first time I've been outside of my house in a year, except to go to the Walgreens on the corner, which is where she did all of her shopping for food and clothes and everything. That would probably be cause for concern. If there's a morning where you just don't want to get out of bed and don't want to face the world, that is normal. 3 weeks of not getting out of bed, that would be cause for concern. And so, I think the one answer, if I had to just give one answer, is to reach out to someone. If it's been 10 or 20 years, it's not like it's going to get fixed in a couple of weeks, just you thinking about it by yourself. So, trusted friend, pastor, other spiritual counselor. And then if that doesn't work, they might refer you, or you might determine yourself, I need to seek out some professional help with this. Support groups are another good thing for some people. Some of us are group people and some of us aren't. Some people go to a grief support group and say, oh my goodness, I can't believe I waited this long to do this. And they stay with it for a year. Other people go and say, oh my goodness, I feel worse now than when I began at the group. But to find a grief support group, I'm going to put in the chat. One of the things that happened over the pandemic was that, of course, a lot of our in-person support groups ended. And we went to nationwide virtual support groups, some that meet by telephone, some that meet by Zoom. The in-person groups were a loss. There's something about being together physically. But the benefit that we weren't anticipating is we're able to have very specific groups, which we couldn't do in person because there wouldn't be enough people. But now we have groups specifically for men, specifically for women, specifically for folks that have lost their spouses, specifically for folks that have lost parents, and they're good-sized groups. Because what makes a group good are the people that are participating in it. And again, not because we all grieve the same way, but because, you're going to share your story and someone's going to share, that's something similar to what I experienced. So support groups can be really helpful as well.
Very, very good. Okay, so one more thing before doing a little shift. What can you say to those that have lost their loved ones due to COVID, or they've lost their loved ones in the midst of a pandemic and they cannot go and spend final moments with them? I think that this is really, difficult, for our nation, period, that people have to die alone now.
Yeah, and so interestingly, the grief professionals have been communicating with the presidential administration and letting them know that we're going to have a second pandemic that comes, and that's a pandemic of grief. So one of the things is in any time there's a complication to grief, and this is a complication to grief. You know, I wasn't able to be there with my mom and hold her hand as she died. And this is an unsatisfactory answer, but it's part of the answer. Is we have to continue to relive those feelings and those experiences. Grief is such a cyclical process. So we're going to reflect on this moment. You know, I feel guilty. I feel sad that I was not able to be with my mom as she was dying. And so so if that's the issue, we're over here and looking at that. And then in a couple of weeks, we might look at it again and have to relive those feelings. But hopefully we're looking at it from a slightly different place. And so it's very much circular in nature. And then as far as what practical things we can do, is maybe sit at your desk with a journal and write out, you know, and this is one of those tasks of grieving that we talked about. How do we maintain that connection? Write out to your mom, here's what I would have said if I had been able to be there with you. And, you know, write those out, you know, write your mom a letter. You know, what is it that you wanted to express? And you might want to do that. You might want to do that several times, because there'll be different things that come to mind and heart each time. So that's just a practical thing that I think would be helpful.
Yes, very, very good. Awesome. So does anyone have any questions for Jason? Jason, you really, really are doing a wonderful job. I really appreciate it because you're the expertise. I am a chaplain as well, but a very new chaplain, you know, maybe 2 years now. So it was pre-COVID and then COVID hit. So, you know, I haven't really even had the opportunity to go out there like, you know, I wanted to even visit people and be there for them. But what I can say is that give people their space, you know, but at the same time, it goes beyond the funeral. You know,
Yes,
people do need you beyond the funeral. So be willing to reach out, you know, and be there in whatever way you can be there. If it's not in person, a text message, a phone call, a quick Zoom, you know, face-to-face, FaceTime, you know, and just say, hey, just wanted to say hi, send cards or flowers or something. But we don't want it to just stop here. We want to continue to be there for our loved ones. Do we have any youth? I just want everyone to know that we do have youth on our live on today. And I know that youth are affected as well. And as the title states, it's mental health. And again, I'm a mental health advocate. I am a member of NAMI. And that's how I got in contact with Jason. So NAMI, yes, NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and it's the world's largest grassroots organization, you know, that advocates for mental illnesses, bring awareness, support, you know, and educate, you know, those or family members suffering, you know, with mental illnesses or have a loved one suffer with mental illnesses. So I like the fact that you brought up, Jason, that, you know, you have to, it kind of ties in with mental illnesses as well, or a mental health condition, because one thing that I don't believe in is medicating grief. You know, I know, you know, in early stages, you know, people talk about getting Xanax, you know, whatever, to be able to deal with, you know, the funeral. And you have to do what you have to do. But at the same time, it's going to go beyond, you know, the medicating. And you do need to help, or it may cause an episode, if you're dealing with a mental health issue, like bipolar or manic depression or something like that. So I am one that, was diagnosed years ago with bipolar because of my traumatic experiences, as a child, and they begin to manifest. So we do want to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, mentally. So is there anything additional and any questions from our youth? Let me ask any questions from our youth. If you do have any questions, you can take your phones off of mute. How do I, say something? How do I help my mom get through this? How do I help my grandma get through this? My uncle, my aunt. How do I, be as helpful as possible? Any questions that you may have.
So someone asked, do you have a support group for children that have lost a parent? So VITAS does. And then we are also involved with an organization. It's not VITAS, but we partner with them. And I'm looking up their information right now. There's an organization in South Florida called the Children's Bereavement Center.
Yes.
And it is a group specifically for children and their parents, and what they did before, and I'm sure they will do again. This is one of the losses of the pandemic for us, is they would have a group that would meet physically, and they would meet for pizza. Parents and children would come, parents and guardians. A lot of times it's parents and grandparents, because the loss that the child was experiencing was a parent, which is heartbreaking. And then they split up into different groups, age specific children's groups, and then a group for the parents. That, like everything else, is virtually. It's Zoom groups right now, but I'm going to post it is Children Bereavement. .org.
I think it's childbereavement.org.
Is it child bereavement?
Yes.
Oh, it is. You are absolutely right.
That's okay. I'm just getting a list together of,
Thank
support.
you.
Yeah, no problem.
And so here's what's great about that is, so it's a support group for children. So support group for children is different than a group for adults. So, they're not going to come and hear a presentation like I just gave to you. They're going to read stories. They're going to play games together. And then, of course, but what all of these children have in common is the fact that they've had a loved one that's died. And so that, there's trained facilitators that help guide those conversations as they come up. So those will meet in person again sometime, but they are they're meeting virtually now. Highly recommend them. No charge for those. It's a grant funded service. Great question. Thank you for that.
That is a very good question. And they serve ages 5 and up, and it also includes adults, and they're 5 and up. And their phone number is 888-988-5438. Their phone number is 888-988-5438. Also, NAMI Palm Beach County, the number is 561-588-3477. You can go to namipbc.org, namipbc.org, or you can go to nami.org. So those are some, and then I would like Jason, also, we have it in the chat, but also if you could give your information verbally, as well at the end. But I do want to just talk briefly. We have maybe like another 7 or 8 minutes, just briefly about loss in terms of not being able to see your loved ones like we were able to pre-COVID, because I kind of consider that as a loss as well.
And what was the
What would
question
be
for me?
your, yeah, in terms of like, I know this is not grief, but it's like a loss. So do you have any recommendations for that?
So for loved ones that we can't see now that are
Yes,
still alive, I do,
yes,
as a matter of fact. And so here's some things, and you know, things have opened back up a little bit, but not completely. And it looks like we might shut down again.
right.
So here are some things that I think are great. First of all, to re-engage the discipline of letter writing, I think is so important. You know, we don't do that anymore, but to send a card, to send a letter. I think another thing is watching entertainment things together. So whether that's a concert, or whether that's a movie on Netflix, to sit down and be together on the phone maybe, and watch those things. For older parents, if you have some that are at least a little bit tech savvy, it might be looking at old pictures together. And if they're not tech savvy, then, you know, do a little bit of work and get copies and prints of those pictures made, and send those to them, and look at those together. Another thing is if you can go on Google, and most of you probably know this because this is a younger group, but you can look up addresses and see actual pictures of the house. So, you know, again, if they're tech savvy, you can do this with them, talking on the phone, on the computer. If they're not, then you might have to print these pictures out and send them to them. But, you know, look at the houses that you lived in over the course of your childhood with them, and you know, to be able to talk about that. And then food is always good. So, you know, you can get anything delivered now. So if you have parents that are homebound, you know, maybe it's calling up the restaurant that you always went to as a child with them, and, you know, order them their favorite meal from that place and have it sent to them. The food holds a lot of memories. My mother has Alzheimer's, and they don't go out anymore. But my mom remembers McDonald's quarter pounders, and she loves them. And so, you know, they'll go through the drive-through, or you know, or have that delivered. Yeah, I think those are some ways to connect. And it's Lisa, exactly like you were saying, about being present to those that are grieving. It's keeping those lines of communication open. And I'm not a romantic about that. That's sometimes hard, awkward work, but it's so important so that they know that we're there.
Yes, yes. Awesome, awesome. Okay, if no one has any questions, I would like to say thank you so much, Jason.
You're welcome.
Unfortunately, we were unable to connect to Facebook Live. There are some technical difficulties, but we will be sharing this video on Facebook Live. And please, please, please go out to Oasis Church International. That's Oasis intl.org. That's our website for the church. And then Oasis Community Development Center is ocdc.org. It will be posted there. It will be posted on our YouTube channel for Oasis Church International, and it will we have the Zoom recording. So if anyone wants the Zoom recording, wants to share it with anyone, please reach out, let me know. Thank you so much. Jason, if you would just close out in terms of just giving your information to our community.
And Aura had asked about the PowerPoint of the presentation. I'm going to email that to Lisa. So use that as you will. I'm fine with that. And again, my name is Jason Fairbanks, and I'm going to put my information in here again, just because I am always willing to talk. My phone number, 561 that's not right. 561-733-6326. And jason.fairbanks@vitas.com. And so any questions on grief, you need someone that's not a family member or close friend, just to kind of to lend an ear for a few moments. That's what I do. Or if you have any questions about hospice care as well, you can ask me about those.
Absolutely. Awesome. Awesome. Well, take care, everybody. Thank you to Tamikia that was in the background looking for questions. Our tech person. Thank you all the youth and adults. You all be blessed. Let's continue to show love and compassion to our neighbors and our friends and our community. Take care. Yes, Jason.
I was just going to say, you mentioning that remind me of a quote of Ram Dass, who is of a different faith than most of us, but still a great person. He died recently, and he said, we're all just here to walk each other home.
Oh, that's good. I like that. Yeah. I like that.
Good to be with you all.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.